All right, I just posted a video with 7 of my favorite buys in Dynasty right now, so now we have to talk through some Dynasty sells, which I know not everybody loves to talk about. There aren't really that many players out there that I consider a straight up sell, especially as a universal sell, whether you're contending or rebuilding. But I did find 4 players on Keep Trade Cut whose values I just think are a bit high for their production, their situation, or both. So we'll start with the quarterback. It's CJ Stroud, who for some reason is still valued as the QB9 on Keep Trade Cut. Why? I have no idea. And this isn't a recovery of value or new 2025 hype that's brought him back into this top 10. No, he has been here all offseason. He was a top 5 Dynasty quarterback all of last year, then started to fall after a poor 2024 season, but only down just a few spots to this QB9 price point, and he's been between QB7 to QB10 for months now. He's barely been penalized at all for his 2024 performance, a performance that absolutely crushed you if you were depending on him as a weekly starter. I would be shocked if you even made the playoffs or even survived the first round of the playoffs with CJ Stroud as an every week starter for your team last year. He averaged 13.7 PPR points per game, which among all quarterbacks to play even just one single game, that was QB 32 overall. Removing the handful of backups who got a random start at some point and just look at the quarterbacks who started at least 4 games last year, he's still only the QB 27 in points per game. QB 28 technically if you only count the games that Drake May started in, not just played in. 13.7 points per game was tied with Kirk Cousins. That is worse than Daniel Jones. It is barely better than Joe Flacco or Mason Rudolph. He only had 2 games over 19 fantasy points, and he had 9 games under 12.5 fantasy points. 9. If you pull up his game log, you close your eyes, you just randomly point and pick a game, chances are you picked one where he scored under 12.5 fantasy points. Now, some of the lack of production can be attributed to the injuries to his receivers last year. I do get that. He lost Nico Collins from weeks 5 through 10. He lost Stephon Diggs from week 9 on. Tank Dell was still recovering from his 2023 injury. Then he got hurt in week 16, missed the last 2 games. But there really wasn't a massive difference in his per game averages in the first 8 games versus those last 8 games. Weeks 1 through 8, Stroud was on pace for 4,100 yards, 23 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, plus 180 rushing yards on the ground. Weeks 9 through 17, his pace was 3,700 yards, 17 touchdowns, 17 interceptions, but 320 rushing yards on the ground. There is a difference, yes, between the two. His yards per attempt dropped from 7.3 to 6.7. His touchdowns dropped. His interceptions went up a lot. He did run more, so for fantasy football, he kind of balanced out a little bit because of the rushing, but there was a drop in production. But like I said, not a huge drop. It's not like he was pacing for 4,500 plus yards and 35 or more touchdowns with Nico, Diggs, and Tank Dell all healthy, and then just suffered tremendously without 1 or even 2 of them. No, his start at the season was pacing for pretty much the same stat line as he had in 2023 as a rookie, which is good production. It is solid for fantasy football, but again, it's just not anything crazy. In 2023, he was the QB 11 in total points, QB 10 in points per game. In 2024, weeks 1 through 8, QB 15 overall, QB 22 in points per game. So in his best year and a half worth of games, with all of his wide receivers pretty much healthy, his ceiling so far has been QB 10 in points per game, yet he's valued as QB 9 in Dynasty on Keep Trade Cut. I understand the age argument and everything in Dynasty value isn't 100 correlated to fantasy production. I get that. But I still think that it's wild that CJ Stroud is valued at or even above his shown ceiling so far, with 0 changes to the Texans' offense or his situation to make us think that he could significantly outproduce that. I'm saying all of this to just basically say CJ Stroud at top 10 or even top 12 quarterback values is just way too high for me. He's above other veterans who have actually been fantasy QB1s multiple times in their careers, like Baker Mayfield, Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray, even Brock Purdy at this point. He's ahead of some very promising sophomore quarterbacks like Bo Nix, JJ McCarthy, Michael Penix. Even Trevor Lawrence has shown more promise through all of his bad situations as well, and is a much improved situation for 2025. That's way better than CJ Stroud's situation is right now. I'm not saying that all of those names should be directly above a CJ Stroud, but I do think it's wild to greatly value Stroud over any one of those guys. So if you have CJ Stroud right now, I would be actively trying to either trade up or trade down from him because there is value in both directions. I would be trying to trade up to a Joe Burrow or to a Jalen Hurts if you can by adding an extra first and then another good piece on top of CJ Stroud. Or you could tier down to a Kyler Murray, Jordan Love, Brock Purdy, Baker Mayfield, Trevor Lawrence type of quarterback, whoever you like from that group, or whoever is most available in your league, or whoever you can get the most on top of, and you're getting a quarterback who's probably going to do the same thing as CJ Stroud this year, maybe even just straight up outproduce him. And you get an extra asset on top to either further your rebuild or help your contending roster even more this year. It just makes no sense to hold on to Stroud right now at these inflated prices for no reason other than just hope and hype. Now, moving to the running back position, we have James Cook, who I do admit I am just lower on than consensus because I'm just not a James Cook person. The type of player and fantasy scorer that he is and mostly has been just is not my cup of tea. Sure, technically speaking, James Cook has been a fantasy RB1 in back-to-back seasons as the RB12 in 2023 and then RB8 in 2024. That is fantastic. What is there not to like about a back-to-back fantasy RB1? Well, if you look closer, that RB12 finish in 2023 was actually RB19 in points per game, and his RB8 finish last year was actually the RB11 in points per game, and that's while scoring 18 touchdowns on the season. He actually tied Derrick Henry and Jahmyr Gibbs in rushing touchdown to lead the NFL last year. Both of those guys were top 4 fantasy running backs, averaging 20 to 21 PPR points per game, but Cook was the RB11, averaging 16.7 PPR points per game with the same number of rushing touchdowns. He barely broke 1,000 rushing yards. His receiving volume decreased from 44 receptions down to 32, and his overall yards per touch dropped for the 3rd year in a row. I mean, I get it. For fantasy football, the best ability is availability, but James Cook just doesn't do it for me. If you remove 8 of his touchdowns last year, so he still had nearly 1,300 total yards and 10 touchdowns, which is still a great season for any running back. Cook falls to RB21 in points per game last year, only 1 point per game better than Tony Pollard and DeAndre Swift, and below Aaron Jones and J.K. Dobbins. If you give him 1,400 total yards and 12 touchdowns, he is still barely even a top 17 fantasy running back in points per game. He is right next to Breece Hall and behind James Conner and David Montgomery. He's just not a special running back in my eyes, and he's not that different than about a dozen other players, especially when you factor in that Josh Allen is going to steal red zone touches every single year. Ty Johnson got way more receiving work than a lot of James Cook managers wanted to see last year. Ray Davis had 130 touches as well and is a very good backup running back. Cook is just not a guy that I'm banking on seeing 250 plus touches in 2025. He can get that many touches. He did so in 2023, but I do think that 2024 is a lot closer to the Bills' formula for their offense and running back usage than 2023 was, and Cook isn't viewed as a real workhorse running back for this Buffalo backfield. Not to mention, he's in the final year of his deal, with Buffalo looking like they have zero intention on an extension anytime soon. He's going to be 26 years old in September, and if he walks in free agency next year, is he going to go to a team that's willing to give him 250 plus touches? Will that team be better than Buffalo offensively? Probably not. So he's not a true difference maker at the position. He's getting close to the age cliff for non-elite running backs, and he might be in a new and worse situation in 2026. Why do we want that in Dynasty at RB13 prices? I would so much rather have Kyren Williams or Chase Brown or Breece Hall than James Cook right now. I would rather have Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, and Christian McCaffrey, and I bet that you could even get something on top of any of those guys to sell James Cook. I would rather have Chuba Hubbard straight up over James Cook, and I know for a fact that you could get something on top of Chuba to make that move. You could also trade down to a Caleb Johnson or an RJ Harvey, even to a Joe Mixon or Alvin Kamara for somebody that's probably going to have more production this year and get something on top to help you also compete this season. You could move James Cook for Rashee Rice or Xavier Worthy or Jameson Williams straight up at the wide receiver position. You could add a second round pick to him and get to Tet McMillan or Travis Hunter, maybe even AJ Brown. I just don't think that there's any reason to hold on to Cook at RB13 prices when there are so many players around him in value if you go up or down. Now, on to wide receivers. And I want to start with a guy that I feel like is the wide receiver version of James Cook, and that is Zay Flowers. Now, Flowers is a very good receiver, just like James Cook is a very good running back, but I don't think that Flowers is a real difference maker at the position, and he certainly hasn't been for fantasy in his 2 years so far. In 2023, as a rookie, he was the wide receiver 30 overall, wide receiver 32 in points per game with 12.9 fantasy points per game. 2024, not a very drastically different season. Wide receiver 25 overall, wide receiver 36 in points per game with 12.3 fantasy points per game, which is weird because he did have 200 more receiving yards in 2024, but he did have 2 fewer touchdowns. 12 to 13 PPR points per game is honestly nothing in fantasy football. That is so mediocre and unhelpful to your team, it's not even funny. Last year alone, there were 13 guys between 11.5 and 13.5 PPR points per game, a list that includes Rashid Shaheed, Darnell Mooney, and Quentin Johnston. 12-ish points per game is just not special, and Flowers has lived there for 2 years, and I don't know what has to happen in Baltimore for that to change. Lamar threw for almost 4,200 yards and 41 touchdowns last year. I mean, how much bigger of a pie do you want to eat from when it takes that much for you to get to 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns? To put that in college prospect wide receiver terms, that is a 17.5 dominator rating for a team wide receiver 1. That is awful. I just don't think that we can look at this Ravens offense and how it operates and continue to blame that for why Zay Flowers isn't better for fantasy football. I think we just have to blame Zay Flowers himself. Derrick Henry is going to get his on the ground. Lamar will as well. Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely are both going to be very heavily involved. Rashad Bateman is a very good perimeter wide receiver. Flowers is the wide receiver 1 on the team, yes, but I just don't think that will ever mean much, and it certainly hasn't meant much for 2 years as someone who hasn't even been a top 30 wide receiver in points per game. So when I see Zay Flowers consistently ranked inside the top 24, maybe even around the top 20 in some Dynasty rankers' eyes, I just can't buy into that because he hasn't even been close to returning that value in actual production. How much longer can he live on youth and name value before people realize that he's just Josh Downs, he's just Jaden Reed, he's just Khalil Shakir, all 3 of whom are pretty much the same age and yet are all valued outside the top 40 on Keep Trade Cut right now, while Flowers is wide receiver 24? So if you have Flowers, you have pretty much the same choices as we have with Stroud and with James Cook, where there is value in either direction. You can go up to a T. Higgins, a Rashee Rice, a Ted McMillan, a Travis Hunter, A.J. Brown by adding an early second-round pick, maybe even a late first. Or you can go down to a Josh Downs, a Jaden Reed, a Khalil Shakir, Jerry Jeudy, Ricky Pearsall, Cortland Sutton, Mike Evans, any receiver like that, depending on if you're competing or rebuilding, and get pretty much the same player as Zay Flowers, but with a little something extra on top. I'm not even opposed to just pivoting to a same tier wide receiver like a Jordan Addison, DK Metcalf, Jamison Williams, Jalen Waddle. At least all of those guys have produced better than Zay Flowers and also have more seasonal upside. They deserve to be top 25 Dynasty wide receivers, whereas Flowers, I think, is just one more mediocre season away from a wide receiver 40-something value while giving you almost zero help in competing this year and even less help rebuilding if he does actually lose that value next year. But speaking of someone who epitomizes the possibility of losing Dynasty value after one more mediocre season, I do think that Garrett Wilson is a Dynasty sell right now. I'm just really ready to re-roll the dice on someone else than hope and pray that Wilson has a meaningful fantasy season in 2025 and even maintains his current value, let alone actually gain value. And I can already see it now. There's already people in the comments typing out that Wilson had his breakout year 3 in 2024 with a wide receiver 10 fantasy finish. And like James Cook, you would be technically correct, but also like James Cook, that wide receiver 10 overall finish for Garrett Wilson was actually wide receiver 21 in points per game. It was no different than Jackson Smith-Njigba, Ladd McConkey, Jerry Jeudy, Jordan Addison, or even Jacoby Myers. He had some great games, he had some bad games, he had a lot of games in between, and that's honestly no different than a decent amount of other wide receivers. His receiving yards weren't any different than what it was in 2022 or 2023. His target volume also pretty much the same. His yards per reception dropped for the 3rd year in a row. The only real difference was 7 touchdowns last year compared to 4 and 3 the previous 2 seasons, and his catch percentage rose from 56% up to 65% because of Aaron Rodgers. But there really wasn't a major difference in end of season numbers that suggests that he actually broke out last year. So now we're entering into year 4 of Garrett Wilson on the New York Jets. And guess what? we have a new offensive coordinator. It's going to be his third one in 4 years. We have a new head coach, a new quarterback. Davante Adams is gone, but it's not like targets have ever been Garrett Wilson's issue, so I don't really think that actually matters. I just don't believe that 2025 is going to be very different than 2022 to 2024. And I can see it again. More people typing in the comments that Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson were college teammates. Like, I didn't know that. And that Justin Fields unlocked DJ Moore 2 years ago. Like, I didn't know that either. Do you know how long it's been since Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson played together? It's been 5 years. 2020, 5 years. They played 14 games together in 2019, but Garrett Wilson was 4th on Ohio State in receptions that year. Then they played 8 games together in 2020, and Wilson was still 2nd on the team behind Chris Olave in receptions. Is that what we're hanging our hats on for Wilson's year 4 breakout and his familiarity with Justin Fields? Then as for Fields unlocking DJ Moore, did you know that DJ Moore is quite literally the only wide receiver that Justin Fields has ever supported for more than 12 PPR points per game? The only wide receiver. It took Russell Wilson coming in for George Pickens to actually do well, who with Justin Fields was on pace for 75 receptions, just barely over 1,000 yards, and 0 receiving touchdowns with a 60% catch percentage. I don't know what happened with DJ Moore that was different than every other wide receiver that Fields has played with in the NFL, but I also don't want to hang my hat on who is currently the one exception, not the standard. But let's assume that Justin Fields is good enough to unlock Garrett Wilson for 2025. How long is Justin Fields going to be the starter for in New York? Because he only signed a 2-year deal, and I don't think it's a guarantee that he even plays both years as the starter. The Bears dumped Fields after DJ Moore's huge season. The Steelers didn't want to keep him. They turned to Russell Wilson to play more games. The Jets haven't invested much into him, so what if Fields is a one and done again in New York as a new quarterback in 2026? I get that there are signals to make Garrett Wilson still be a very good option to hold on to for 2025 for Dynasty, but I think there are just as many, or possibly even more signals, telling me to just pivot to someone else who maybe has a similar floor but actually has a way higher ceiling. I would rather have Jackson Smith-Njigba and Ladd McConkey. I would rather re-roll with Travis Hunter or Tech McMillan as rookies. If you're competing right now, I would much rather have A.J. Brown for the next 2 to 3 years than Garrett Wilson. I would even consider trading down to T. Higgins and getting a little something extra on top. Or I think a better idea is just to trade up, add an early second or even a late first, and go get Puka Nacua, go get Nico Collins, go get Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Use Garrett Wilson as a springboard into an actual difference-making player with a stud alpha wide receiver. I'm sure your starting lineup will thank you for making that decision, and that one move might actually be the difference between a first-round playoff exit this year versus a championship-level team.